The Veiled Bride. The grand imperial hall of Solaris Prime was filled with silence. Not the silence of peace, but of tension. Hundreds of guests, dignitaries, and soldiers from across the galaxy watched as the ceremony unfolded. They stood beneath the golden banners of the Empire, waiting for the moment when two powerful factions would unite through marriage. At the center of it all stood Captain Adrian Voss, a decorated human warrior. Dressed in his formal military uniform, he stood tall, unshaken. His dark eyes scanned the vast hall, trained to detect threats. But today, the greatest threat wasn't an enemy army. It was the woman he was about to marry. She stood before him, motionless, a figure hidden beneath flowing silver and black robes, her face concealed by a delicate, shimmering veil. Lady Seraphis of the Veil. A name whispered across the stars. No one had ever seen her face. Not even Adrian. And yet, in mere moments, they would be bound by law, by duty, by a marriage neither of them had chosen. The price of peace. This was no love story. It was a contract. A treaty between two powerful civilizations, the Human Alliance and the Seraphim Dominion. For years, their worlds had been at war. Countless battles, thousands dead. Neither side could claim victory. So instead, they forged a truce. A peace deal sealed by marriage. Adrian had been chosen to represent humanity. Not as a diplomat, but as a soldier. A symbol of strength. And Seraphis? She was the last remaining heir of the Seraphim Dominion, a mysterious, secretive empire. Their people believed in tradition, secrecy, and power. They were feared. Respected. And yet, their future now rested in this moment. Adrian glanced at the veiled woman standing before him. He had faced assassins. Commanded troops in brutal battles. Walked through fire. And yet, standing here, about to take vows with a stranger, he felt more uncertain than ever. Who was she? And why did she hide her face? The ceremony. The High Chancellor stepped forward, holding an ancient scroll. His deep voice echoed across the vast hall. We gather here to witness the union of two great bloodlines. Adrian barely listened. His attention was locked on Seraphis. She had not spoken a single word. She had not moved. She was like a statue, perfectly still, perfectly composed. Adrian had heard rumors. That beneath the veil, she was inhumanly beautiful. That her eyes held power no one could understand. That her face, if ever revealed, could change the fate of the galaxy. But those were just stories. Weren't they? He didn't believe in myths. He believed in what he could see. And right now, all he could see was a woman locked in a cage of silk and secrecy. The Chancellor continued. Do you, Captain Adrian Voss, take Lady Seraphis of the Veil as your bonded wife, sworn by oath and duty? Adrian clenched his jaw. There was no choice. His voice was firm. I do. And do you, Lady Seraphis, take Captain Adrian Voss, bound by the will of the Empire? A pause. For the first time, Seraphis moved. Her hands, delicate, gloved, clasped together. Then, softly, she spoke. Her voice was like a whisper of wind through darkened halls. I do. The Chancellor nodded. By the power of the Empire, you are now bound as one. The hall erupted in applause. But Adrian barely heard it. His heart pounded. Because for the first time, Seraphis had spoken. And something about her voice sent a shiver down his spine. The wedding night. Hours later, the celebration was over. The halls were empty. The guests had gone. Adrian stood in his private quarters, staring at the closed doors leading to his new wife's chamber. They had not spoken since the ceremony. Seraphis had simply disappeared into the shadows, escorted away by her attendants. Now, he stood alone, waiting. He had so many questions. But only one mattered. Who is she? A soft click echoed through the room. The door slowly opened. And there she was. Still draped in her elegant silver and black robes. Still veiled. Still unreadable. Adrian stepped forward. You don't have to do this, he said carefully. I know this wasn't your choice either. Seraphis tilted her head slightly. And yet, here we are. Adrian exhaled. He had spent years on the battlefield, navigating war, reading enemies, predicting moves. But Seraphis? She was a mystery he couldn't solve. You never remove your veil, he said. Not even now. Seraphis was silent for a moment. Then, she lifted her hands. Slowly. Deliberately. And she began to pull the veil away. Adrian's breath caught. The fabric fell. And for the first time, he saw her face. His eyes widened. Shock. Disbelief. Realization. The truth hit him like a thunderstrike. Seraphis was not who he thought she was. And now. Nothing would ever be the same again. The secret beneath the veil. Adrian couldn't move. The veil fell to the floor, pooling at Seraphis's feet like liquid silver. And for the first time, he saw her face. He expected beauty. The rumors spoke of an alien noble whose beauty was too powerful to be witnessed. But this? This was something else. Seraphis was not like any being he had ever seen. Her skin, smooth and luminous, was marked by faint glowing lines, swirling across her cheeks and forehead, ancient symbols of a language lost to time. Her eyes, not human, not entirely alien, shifted in color, from deep violet to molten gold, as if something inside her was alive. And then he saw the mark. A sigil, right between her brows. One that should not exist. One that should have died with a race long thought extinct. Adrian's pulse pounded in his ears. He took an involuntary step back. This is impossible. Seraphis didn't move. She simply watched him. Now you understand, she whispered. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had heard of this before. A myth. A legend. A warning. But the reality was standing before him. You're one of them, he breathed. Seraphis held his gaze. I am firstborn. The weight of a name. Adrian's body tensed. The firstborn. A race so ancient, so powerful, that even the mightiest empires had feared them. Long ago, they ruled the stars. Their knowledge, their abilities, their control over matter and energy, unmatched. Then, suddenly, they vanished. No records. No graves. No survivors. The empire had erased them. Or so he had been told. And yet. Seraphis stood before him. The last of her kind. Adrian swallowed hard. The empire, they think your people are gone. Seraphis nodded slowly. Because that is what they wanted. Adrian's mind raced. If she was truly firstborn, then marrying her wasn't just about peace. It was about control. The empire hadn't forged this marriage to unite two factions. They had done it to ensure that if the firstborn still existed, they would belong to them. He exhaled sharply. So I wasn't chosen to be your husband. Seraphis tilted her head. You were chosen to be my captor. The assassins arrive. Before Adrian could respond. The lights flickered. A warning alarm blared. Seraphis's golden eyes darkened. They're here. Adrian grabbed his sidearm. Who? Seraphis turned toward the door. The ones who cannot allow the truth to survive. A loud explosion rocked the palace. Adrian moved instinctively, grabbing Seraphis's arm and pulling her behind him. Through the walls, he could hear the sound of armored boots. Assassins. Not just any assassins, imperial blackguards. The Emperor's personal executioners. Adrian's breath was steady, but his mind burned with questions. They planned this. His voice was low, dangerous. They never meant for this marriage to last, did they? Seraphis's voice was unreadable. You were never meant to see my face. Adrian gritted his teeth. And now, because he had. They were both marked for death. The escape. The first assassin burst through the door. Adrian didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot hit the assassin's armor, not enough to kill, but enough to stagger. Seraphis moved faster than he expected. She lifted a hand, and the air shimmered. The assassin froze mid-motion. His weapon crumbled to dust. Adrian's stomach dropped. Seraphis had barely lifted a finger. What was that? He demanded. Seraphis didn't answer. She grabbed his wrist, pulling him toward the corridor. We don't have time for explanations. More assassins stormed in. Too many. Seraphis raised her free hand. The walls shook. The air hummed. And then. The entire corridor collapsed. Adrian's breath hitched. Seraphis had just brought down an entire section of the palace, without touching it. She turned to him, eyes glowing. We need to leave. Now. Adrian exhaled, forcing himself to move. Fine, he said. But when we're out of here, you're telling me everything. Seraphis hesitated, then nodded. Together, they ran. Through fire, through the shadows of a crumbling empire. A soldier and a living legend. Bound by fate. And hunted by an empire that feared what they could become. A marriage built on lies. The starborn cruiser sped through the void, leaving the burning palace behind. Adrian sat in the co-pilot's chair, gripping the console, his mind racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had been sent here to marry a noblewoman, to seal a treaty between two great factions. Instead, he had discovered a secret that could shatter the empire itself. And now. He was a fugitive. The tension between them. Behind him, Seraphis stood near the viewport, her silver robes illuminated by the distant glow of Solaris Prime. Her veil was gone. Her face was still a mystery, but now, for an entirely different reason. She wasn't just a noble. She wasn't even fully alien. She was firstborn, a race the Empire had declared extinct centuries ago. Adrian exhaled, pushing back his anger. Start talking. Seraphis turned, her golden eyes unreadable. About what? Adrian clenched his jaw. Don't play games with me. You knew this would happen, didn't you? You knew they would try to kill us. Seraphis was silent for a long moment. Then, she said, yes. Adrian's fists tightened. Then why the hell did you go through with it? Seraphis met his gaze. Because if I refused, they would have killed me before the wedding even began. Adrian blinked. He hadn't considered that. For a moment, he actually felt stupid. But still, she had lied. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice quieter this time. Seraphis tilted her head. Would you have believed me? Adrian opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. Would he have? Would he have believed that the Empire had built its power on a lie? That the firstborn, the so-called gods of the past, had not simply vanished, but had been erased? He looked away. Damn it. He wasn't sure anymore. The Empire's greatest lie. Seraphis stepped forward, her voice softer now. You were never meant to be my husband, Adrian. You were meant to be my warden. Adrian exhaled sharply. Yeah, I figured that part out. Seraphis continued. My people were once rulers of the stars. We built the first cities, the first gateways between worlds. Adrian had heard the myths. But myths were just that, stories. Right? Seraphis shook her head. But then came the war. Not against another species. Not against invaders. Her eyes darkened. The war was against time itself. Adrian frowned. What? Seraphis turned to the viewport. We were too powerful, Adrian. We could bend reality, shape entire worlds. Adrian's stomach twisted. He remembered how she had collapsed the palace corridor without touching it. Seraphis wasn't just royalty. She was a living weapon. We saw the future, she whispered. And we saw what we would become. Adrian's pulse quickened. What did you see? Seraphis exhaled. Our empire would fall. We would become tyrants, monsters. A force so feared that the galaxy itself would rise against us. Adrian leaned forward. And what did you do? Seraphis's voice was barely a whisper now. We erased ourselves. The cost of peace. Adrian couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're saying your people wiped themselves out? Seraphis nodded. We made the choice. We scattered our people. We sealed our knowledge, locked our powers away in bloodlines that would fade into history. Adrian shook his head. Then why are you still alive? Seraphis's lips parted, but she hesitated. Then, finally, she said. Because someone woke me up. Adrian felt the chill crawl up his spine. Who? Seraphis didn't answer. But Adrian saw something in her eyes. Something close to fear. He exhaled, rubbing his face. Okay. So let's say I believe you. He turned to her. Why does the Empire want you dead? Seraphis sat down across from him. Because they built their power on the ruins of my people. Adrian's fingers curled into fists. So, if the truth gets out. Seraphis nodded. The Empire falls. The hunters close in. Before Adrian could respond, an alarm blared. Sienna's voice crackled over the comms. We've got company. Adrian's head snapped toward the console. A fleet. Not just any fleet, Imperial blackguard interceptors. Damn it. Adrian grabbed the comm, how long until they reach us? Sienna's voice was tense. 5 minutes. Maybe less. Adrian turned to Seraphis. Can you do anything? She didn't respond immediately. Then, she took his hand. Adrian froze. What are you? The moment their skin touched, a shockwave of light burst around them. Adrian gasped, his vision flickering. For a split second, he saw something impossible. A world long gone. A city that hovered in the void, made of crystal and fire. A palace that stretched across the stars. And at its center, a throne, empty in waiting. Then, it was gone. The ship lurched. Adrian stumbled backward, breathing hard. Seraphis stood, her golden eyes burning brighter than ever. Her voice was steady. If we are to survive this, Adrian, you need to trust me. Adrian's chest heaved. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was standing next to a person. Or something far greater. His comm buzzed. 2 minutes until impact. Sienna shouted. Adrian looked at Seraphis. Then, without thinking, he grabbed his weapon. Fine, he said. Let's see if we can survive a little longer. The starborn cruiser turned, heading straight into the enemy fleet. And in that moment, Adrian made his choice. He wasn't just running. He was fighting for the truth. For her. The Empire's darkest secret. The starborn cruiser twisted through the void, dodging plasma fire as the Imperial blackguard interceptors closed in. Adrian gritted his teeth, hands gripping the controls. Shields at 20%. Sienna shouted over the comms. We won't last long. Then we end this fast, Adrian growled. But deep down, he knew they were outgunned. Seraphis sat beside him, unnaturally calm, her golden eyes fixed on the battle outside. You have a plan? Adrian asked. Seraphis turned to him. Yes, she said softly. And then, she reached for his hand again. Adrian barely had time to react before a pulse of energy exploded through the cockpit. His vision shattered. And suddenly, he wasn't in the ship anymore. A glimpse of the past. Adrian saw everything. A world before the Empire. A city of floating towers, glowing with energy not of this time. Ships that moved without engines. People who controlled the very fabric of reality. And in the center of it all, a throne of light. Seraphis stood before it. Not as she was now, but as she had once been. A ruler. A goddess. The last of the firstborn. Adrian gasped, stumbling backward. What is this? Seraphis turned to him, her voice echoing across time. The truth. The vision shifted. The city burned. Ships fell from the sky. The firstborn were not wiped out by war. They chose to disappear. Adrian saw the ritual. The moment they erased themselves from history. The last of the firstborn leaders sealed away their knowledge, their power, their very existence. And then, they were gone. The Empire had not destroyed them. They had taken their place. The world faded. Adrian's vision snapped back to reality. And the battle was still raging. The war that never ended. Adrian gasped, struggling to breathe. What the hell did you just show me? Seraphis's voice was quiet. The war never ended, Adrian. The Empire is not fighting its enemies. She turned to him, her golden eyes filled with something he had never seen before. Fear. They are fighting time itself. Adrian's pulse pounded. Everything he had believed, the war, the treaties, the history of the Empire. It was all a lie. The Empire had not risen to power on its own. It had stolen a throne that was never meant for them. And now, they were willing to kill anyone who learned the truth. Adrian clenched his fists. So what now? Seraphis met his gaze. We fight back. The awakening. The ship shook violently as another blast hit their shields. Adrian cursed. We're out of time. Seraphis placed her hand on the control panel. The ship hummed. Then, everything stopped. Adrian blinked. The blackguard ships. They were frozen in space. Their engines dead. Their weapons silent. Adrian turned to Seraphis, his breath catching. Her eyes burned like twin suns. This is why they fear me, she whispered. Adrian felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just a noble. She wasn't just a fugitive. She was power itself. And the Empire had made a mistake. They had let her live. A new war begins. The blackguard ships shuddered as Seraphis finally released them. She turned to Adrian. You have a choice, she said. Adrian clenched his jaw. This is bigger than both of us, isn't it? Seraphis nodded. The Empire is fighting to keep its throne, Adrian. And if they win. Her voice was quiet, but full of certainty. The galaxy will never be free. Adrian exhaled, looking at his crew. Sienna. Torvax. Rilo. They had been running. Hiding. Trying to survive. But now. Now they had a chance to do something more. Adrian met Seraphis's gaze. Then let's burn their throne to the ground. Seraphis smiled. For the first time in her life. She wasn't alone. The starborn cruiser turned, heading into the unknown. And the war for the truth had begun. The battle for truth. The starborn cruiser sped through deep space, leaving behind the frozen wreckage of the Imperial blackguard fleet. Seraphis stood at the viewport, silent, her golden eyes reflecting the distant stars. Adrian stood beside her, arms crossed. His mind was racing. They had made their choice. They weren't running anymore. No. They were fighting back. But against an empire that controlled entire sectors of the galaxy, how did you even start a war like this? The first move. Sienna's voice crackled over the comms. Captain, we've got something. Adrian turned toward the main console. Talk to me. Sienna tapped the screen. Encrypted transmission. Coming from inside Imperial space. Adrian's brow furrowed. A trap. Seraphis shook her head. No. It's from someone who knows the truth. She leaned forward, studying the coded message. Slowly, she exhaled. Adrian caught the look in her eyes. You recognize the sender. Seraphis hesitated. Then, softly. It's my brother. A forgotten heir. Adrian stared at her. I thought you were the last firstborn. Seraphis's hands curled into fists. So did I. She turned to face him. If he's alive, that means the Empire didn't wipe out my people completely. Adrian narrowed his eyes. Or it means they're using him as bait. Seraphis nodded. There's only one way to find out. She pointed at the coordinates. He's being held in the Imperial vaults on Xarian 5. Adrian felt his stomach drop. You mean the most secure prison in the galaxy? Seraphis met his gaze, calm and unshaken. Yes. Adrian sighed, rubbing his temples. Of course he is. Torvax grunted. So. Suicide mission. Sienna smirked. Sounds like a Tuesday. Adrian glanced at Seraphis. Are you sure he's worth the risk? Seraphis's voice was steel. If my brother is still alive, then the firstborn's last secret is locked inside that prison. Adrian exhaled. He knew what this meant. They weren't just going after a prisoner. They were going after the Empire's most valuable secret. This wasn't just about rescuing a firstborn. This was about breaking the Empire's grip on the galaxy. Adrian turned to his crew. Gear up. They had a war to start. Breaking into the unbreakable. Xarian 5. A fortress world. Surrounded by defense satellites, shielded by energy barriers, patrolled by legions of Imperial forces. It was said that no one had ever escaped from its vaults. Adrian planned to be the first. The starborn cruiser dropped out of hyperspace, hiding behind the debris of a destroyed freighter. Sienna studied the data feed. Scanners show heavy security, but I can find a gap in their defenses. Seraphis shook her head. There's a faster way. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Oh. You gonna freeze time again? Seraphis smirked. Not quite. She lifted her hands. And the stars flickered. Adrian's breath caught as the entire ship disappeared. Not cloaked. Not hidden. Gone. Like it had never existed. He turned to her, stunned. You can do that? Seraphis's voice was calm. I can do a lot of things. Adrian exhaled. Remind me never to piss you off. The invisible starborn cruiser drifted toward the planet. And the infiltration began. The vaults of Xarian 5. The team moved through the fortress, their every step silent. Seraphis's power cloaked them, keeping them hidden from cameras and guards. Adrian led the way, pulse rifle in hand. Torvax, the massive Brathian warrior, carried a heavy blaster. Sienna had her sniper rifle, eyes scanning for trouble. They reached the deepest chamber of the vaults. A massive door stood before them. Seriphis pressed her palm against the surface. The metal trembled. The ancient security systems collapsed in an instant. And the door slid open. Inside, a single cryostasis chamber. And inside that, a man. Seriphis stepped forward, her breath unsteady. My brother. Adrian kept his weapon ready. If he's been in stasis, how do we know he's still? Then, the chamber hissed. Frost evaporated. The figure inside stirred. Slowly. He opened his eyes. And Adrian's blood ran cold. Because his eyes were exactly like Seraphis's. But darker. More intense. More dangerous. The man stepped forward, stretching his fingers. And the room shook as the air around him bent to his will. Seriphis swallowed hard. Brother, she whispered. The man turned, his gaze like fire. Who woke me up? His voice was power itself. And Adrian knew. This man was nothing like Seriphis. This man was a weapon. And now. He was awake. The Empire's greatest fear. Adrian aimed his gun. I'm guessing this guy wasn't frozen for fun. Seriphis stepped between them. Lower your weapon. Adrian didn't move. Seriphis exhaled. He was put here for one reason. The man tilted his head. And what reason is that, sister? Seriphis hesitated. Then, softly. They were afraid of you. The man smiled. A slow, deadly smile. As they should be. The room shook again. Adrian cursed. Yeah, I don't like this guy. Seriphis turned to him. We need him. Adrian clenched his jaw. The Empire had feared this man enough to lock him away for centuries. And now. They had set him free. Adrian exhaled sharply. Fine, he muttered. But if he tries anything, I'm shooting him. Seriphis smirked. You could try. The man's voice was quiet, but it sent chills down Adrian's spine. Let's burn this empire to the ground. And just like that. The war for the truth truly began. The war for the future. The starborn cruiser roared through space, leaving the shattered remains of Xarian 5 behind. Adrian stood in the war room, staring at the star charts. His fists clenched as his mind raced. They had done the impossible, broken into the most secure imperial prison and freed Seraphis's brother. But now. They weren't just fugitives. They were leading a rebellion. And that meant one thing. The Empire would stop at nothing to erase them. The rebellion awakens. Sienna tapped the comms console. Intercepting encrypted signals, Imperial war fleets are mobilizing. Torvax grunted. They're coming for blood. Adrian exhaled. They want to end this before it starts. Seraphis's voice was calm. Then we must move first. Her brother, Kales, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He had barely spoken since his release. Now, he smirked. You plan to fight an empire with one ship? Adrian glared at him. We'll find allies. Kales chuckled. Allies? Or pawns? Adrian clenched his jaw. This man was dangerous. Seriphis had power, but Kales was something else. Something colder. And Adrian wasn't sure if he was here to help them, or use them. The first strike. Sienna's fingers flew across the controls. I've got something. A distress beacon. Adrian frowned. From where? Sienna hesitated. From the lost fleets. The room went silent. Everyone knew the stories. Centuries ago, during the Empire's rise, an entire fleet of defectors vanished. Some believed they were destroyed. Some believed they were waiting for the right moment to return. Adrian met Seraphis's gaze. This could be our chance. She nodded. If they still live, they will stand with us. Kayleigh chuckled. Or they will kill us. Adrian smirked. Only one way to find out. The Ghost Fleet. The starborn cruiser dropped out of hyperspace, approaching the coordinates. What they saw made Adrian's breath catch. A graveyard of warships. Massive, ancient vessels drifting through the void, silent and broken. This place is a tomb, Torvax muttered. Adrian shook his head. No. It's a battlefield. Then. A voice crackled over the comms. Who dares trespass into our domain? Adrian stiffened. They're alive. Sienna nodded. Barely. Their systems are failing. They've been cut off for decades. Seraphis leaned forward. We are not your enemy, she said into the comms. We come seeking allies against the Empire. A pause. Then. The Empire? That monster still breathes. Adrian's heart pounded. This fleet had been hiding in the shadows for years. And now. They had a reason to rise again. The Emperor's response. But before they could speak further. An alarm blared. Sienna cursed. New contacts, Imperial dreadnoughts incoming. Adrian's stomach twisted. The Empire found us. Seraphis tensed. Kayleigh grinned. Perfect. Time to remind them why they fear us. Adrian turned to the comms. You wanted a reason to fight? This is it. The Ghost Fleet came alive. Engines ignited. Weapons powered up. And for the first time in centuries. The lost warriors of the past joined the war for the future. The battle begins. The first Imperial warship opened fire. Adrian gripped the controls. Evasive maneuvers. The starborn cruiser twisted through enemy fire, weaving between the larger warships. Sienna sniped enemy fighters from the deck. Torvax tore through enemy mechs in the hangar bay. And Seraphis. Seraphis unleashed power that had been dormant for centuries. With a single gesture, she tore apart an Imperial destroyer, its metal hull ripping like paper. Kayleigh laughed, watching the destruction. Now this is war. Adrian had no time to be stunned. They were winning. But then. A shadow fell over the battlefield. A colossal ship emerged from hyperspace. Adrian's blood ran cold. Sienna's voice was a whisper. The Emperor is here. The final confrontation. The Imperial flagship loomed like a black sun. Adrian's hands clenched the controls. Brace for impact. Seraphis stood, her golden eyes blazing. This is it, she whispered. Kayleigh grinned. Then let's make history. Adrian took a breath. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was the beginning of the end. And as the Emperor's fleet opened fire, the rebellion's true war began. The final stand. The Imperial flagship loomed over the battlefield like a silent executioner. Adrian's hands tightened around the controls as the Emperor's fleet opened fire. This was it. The moment that would decide the future of the galaxy. Seraphis stood beside him, her golden eyes burning with ancient power. Kayleigh grinned. Hope you're ready to die, Captain. Adrian smirked. Not today. The starborn cruiser surged forward, leading the charge. And the war for the truth began. The Emperor enters the battlefield. The comms crackled. A voice, cold, powerful, inhuman. Seraphis. You should have stayed dead. Seraphis's fingers curled into fists. And you should have left the past buried. A pause. Then, laughter. Do you truly believe you can stop me? Adrian's chest tightened. The Emperor wasn't just a ruler. He was the last remnant of the ones who had erased the firstborn. A warlord who had ruled through deception. And now, he was coming to end them himself. Seraphis turned to Adrian. If we don't stop him here, he will erase us all. Adrian nodded. Then we make this count. The battle began. The rebellion's last hope. The Ghost Fleet fired first. The lost warships of the past, once silent, roared to life. Hundreds of plasma cannons lit up the void. The Imperial fleet returned fire, sending shockwaves through space. Adrian twisted the starborne cruiser, dodging a barrage of energy blasts. Sienna sniped enemy pilots from the bridge. Torvax tore apart boarding mechs with his bare hands. But the Empire was endless. For every ship they destroyed, 3 more took its place. And then, the Emperor moved. The true power of the Empire. A black wave of energy spread from the Imperial flagship. Ships froze mid-air. Engines failed. Weapons stopped working. Adrian's blood turned cold. It wasn't a weapon. It was him. Seraphis's breath hitched. He's using firstborn power. Kaylee's growled. Impossible. He is not one of us. Seraphis's voice was low. No. But he stole it. Adrian clenched his fists. The Emperor wasn't just a warlord. He was a thief of time itself. And now, he was about to erase them all. The final confrontation. Seraphis turned to Adrian. There's only one way to end this. Adrian met her gaze. She didn't have to say it. They both knew. This wasn't just a battle of ships. This was a battle of power. Seraphis and Kaylee's were the last of the firstborn. The Emperor was a false god. And now, the real ones would take their throne back. Inside the Emperor's throne room, the starborne cruiser punched through the Imperial defenses. Adrian, Seraphis, and Kaylee's boarded the flagship, cutting through enemy forces. They stormed into the throne room. And there he stood. The Emperor. Tall. Cloaked in shadows. His eyes burned with stolen light. Adrian raised his weapon. The Emperor lifted a hand. And reality bent around him. You are nothing. The firstborn are gone. Seraphis stepped forward. Her voice was calm, absolute. Then let me show you why you feared us. The last battle. The throne room exploded with power. Seraphis and Kaylee's unleashed the full force of their bloodline. The Emperor matched them blow for blow. Energy crackled. Walls shattered. Time itself fractured. Adrian couldn't move. He was a soldier. A warrior. But this? This was a war of gods. The Emperor falls. The fight raged, until Seraphis made her final move. She let go. Not of her power. Not of her past. But of fear. For the first time, she embraced everything she was meant to be. And in that moment, the Emperor screamed. His stolen power ripped away. His body collapsed into dust. And the Empire fell with him. A new dawn. Adrian stood in the ruins of the throne room. The Emperor was gone. The war was over. Seraphis turned to him. Her golden eyes were brighter than ever. Adrian exhaled. So, what now? Seraphis smiled. Now. We rebuild. Kaylee's chuckled. Or we rule. Adrian raised an eyebrow. You're not ruling anything. Kaylee smirked. We'll see. The starborne cruiser rose into the sky. The galaxy had changed forever. And for the first time, it was truly free. Adrian looked at Seraphis. You still think you should have stayed hidden? Seraphis smiled. No. I think I finally found my place. Adrian smirked. Good. Because we've got a lot of work to do. The engines roared to life. And the future began.